The woods have always carried an unsettling silence, an emptiness that makes you feel both tiny and watched at the same time. Some go in for peace and escape, but not everyone comes back with the same calm they were searching for. Tonight, you'll hear 3 disturbing, true stories of people who found themselves alone in the woods, and what they encountered will make you think twice before ever stepping into the forest again. The cabin retreat had always been described as a peaceful escape, tucked away deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city and the chaos of everyday life. When Daniel first arrived, the stillness was exactly what he had hoped for. The air smelled of pine and damp soil. The wooden boards of the small cabin creaked softly under his boots, and the only sounds came from the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an owl. He had rented the cabin for a week, wanting solitude, hoping to reset his mind after months of long work hours and sleepless nights. The first day passed quietly, almost idyllic, as he explored the trails around the property and settled into the cozy warmth of the cabin. As dusk fell, the woods transformed. What had seemed serene in daylight now carried an unfamiliar weight. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the silence seemed to thicken, broken only by the faint sound of branches snapping somewhere far off. Daniel told himself it was nothing more than deer or raccoons moving through the brush. He made himself a cup of tea, sat near the window, and tried to enjoy the evening calm. Yet the feeling of being alone was different now, no longer peaceful but heavy, as though the woods pressed closer with each passing hour. The first night brought a strange unease. Lying in bed, Daniel heard something faint outside. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing along the edge of the cabin. He froze, his breath caught in his chest, straining to listen. The footsteps would move for a few seconds, then stop, then continue again. He told himself it had to be an animal, though in his heart he knew the sound was too steady, too purposeful. Eventually the noise faded into the distance, and after hours of restless tossing, sleep finally claimed him. When morning came, sunlight streaming through the trees almost erased the fear of the night. Daniel tried to laugh at himself for being so jumpy, chalking it up to isolation and nerves. He spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, enjoying the solitude again. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was following, keeping pace just far enough away to stay unseen. Every so often he would stop listening, only for the forest to fall into complete silence, not even the birds singing. It was as if everything around him was waiting, holding its breath. Returning to the cabin at dusk, Daniel noticed something that froze him where he stood. In the soft dirt just outside his cabin door, there were footprints. Not his own, not the rough outline of boots, but bare footprints, pressed deeply into the earth, circling the cabin again and again as if someone had walked the perimeter for hours. His pulse quickened as he scanned the tree line, but nothing moved, nothing stirred, and yet he knew he was not as alone as he had first believed. The second night came quickly, and with it, the unease returned stronger than before. Daniel tried to distract himself with a book, the fire crackling softly in the small stone fireplace, but every page he turned felt heavier, his eyes darting again and again toward the windows that framed the darkness outside. The woods were vast and endless, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something in them was narrowing its focus directly on him. When he finally set the book aside and listened, he swore he could hear it again. The faint crunch of leaves and branches underfoot, pacing just out of sight. The sound came and went, irregular, as though whoever or whatever was out there wanted him to know they were close, but not close enough to be seen. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was shallow and restless. A sharp tapping pulled him awake in the middle of the night. His eyes shot open, heart pounding as the sound repeated, slow and steady, against the glass of the window near his bed. He lay frozen, staring into the darkness, his own reflection faintly visible in the pane. Behind it, for just a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement. A pale outline, a shadow that shifted before disappearing into the blackness. He sat upright, hardly breathing, straining his ears to catch any noise, but all that remained was silence. For the rest of the night, Daniel didn't dare close his eyes again. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on him. He walked outside, his skin prickling with cold air, and scanned the ground near the windows. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the scatter of fallen leaves. But then he noticed impressions in the earth. Bare footprints again, smaller this time, as if a child had walked barefoot in the cold night air, circling the cabin once more. They led away into the trees, vanishing in the undergrowth, giving no clue as to where they came from or how far they stretched. He crouched and touched one of the prints, the dirt still soft as though it had been made only hours earlier. Daniel tried to convince himself he was overthinking everything. People told stories about strange happenings in the woods all the time. He reasoned that maybe hikers had wandered near, though the cabin was miles off the main trail, and the idea of children wandering barefoot at night didn't make any sense. Still, he tried to carry on with his day as if nothing was wrong. He chopped wood, prepared food, and attempted to push away the gnawing dread that lingered. But when the sun dipped low and the forest turned to shadows, the fear returned with an almost physical weight pressing against him. As night fell once more, Daniel locked the doors, checked the windows twice, and kept the fire burning. Yet despite his precautions, the uneasy awareness that he was not alone seemed to seep through the walls of the cabin itself, reminding him with every creak of wood and gust of wind that something, or someone, was waiting in the darkness beyond. The third night was colder, the kind of chill that seeped into the wood of the cabin and made every breath visible in the faint glow of the fire. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the window as if daring something to appear, his nerves stretched to breaking. Hours passed with nothing but the whisper of wind against the trees, and yet his body refused to relax. He felt as though he was under constant observation, every movement weighed and noted by something just beyond the reach of his eyes. It was near midnight when the unease took a sharper edge. He heard it clearly this time. Footsteps moving closer, crunching the frosted leaves outside in slow, deliberate rhythm. His stomach knotted as the sound approached the cabin, then stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so complete it made his ears ring. For a moment, he almost convinced himself it was nothing, until a faint scraping came against the wood of the wall, just beneath the bedroom window. It was not the sound of an animal, it was the drag of fingers, slow and intentional, as though someone was feeling their way along the outer boards. Daniel's throat went dry, his breath quick and shallow. He forced himself to step closer to the window, the dim firelight casting his reflection on the glass. For a long moment there was nothing but his own pale face staring back at him. But then, behind the faint outline, another face appeared. It was so quick he thought he imagined it. Two dark eyes, wide and unblinking, framed by skin that seemed too pale, too stretched. He staggered back, heart slamming against his ribs, the chair behind him toppling to the floor with a loud crack. By the time he dared to look again, the window reflected only darkness. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. He grabbed the poker from beside the fire, clutching it tightly in his shaking hands, and moved from window to window, checking each one as though reassurance could be found in proving they were still locked. But no matter where he looked, the feeling of being watched never left. Outside, the forest loomed silently, the thick trees like prison bars in the night. He knew someone was out there, someone circling, testing, waiting. The hours dragged by until the first gray hints of dawn broke through the branches. Daniel hadn't slept at all, his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. When he finally stepped outside, the cold air stung his face, but what froze him in place was the ground before the cabin. The footprints had returned, circling in patterns that seemed more deliberate than before, overlapping and twisting as though someone had walked endlessly around the cabin all night. In the soft earth below the window where he had seen the face, the prints pressed deeper, as if whoever had been there had stood unmoving for hours, watching through the glass while he slept just a few feet away. By the time the fourth day arrived, Daniel felt like a man unraveling. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, his body sluggish, but his nerves remained sharp as broken glass. The forest no longer felt like a retreat, it was a cage, and every sound within it was a taunt. He considered leaving early, packing his bag and hiking back toward civilization, but a part of him feared what might follow him if he tried. Somehow, the idea of staying inside the cabin felt safer, though the unease of confinement was eating at him. He forced himself to step outside during the daylight, hoping the open air would calm his thoughts. The woods stretched out endlessly, sunlight filtering in thin beams through the trees. The silence was wrong again, too complete. Birds didn't sing. No small animals darted between the undergrowth. He felt the weight of the forest pressing in as though it was holding its breath, watching him. He followed one of the trails for a while, keeping his eyes on the dirt, and that was when he noticed the more footprints, identical to the ones around his cabin, bare and perfectly defined in the soft soil. They led away from the cabin and deeper into the woods. Against his better judgment, Daniel followed. Each step took him further from safety, and yet he couldn't stop. The trail twisted through thick trees and tangled roots, and the footprints continued, always just ahead, Finally, he reached a small clearing and his stomach tightened. In the center was a fallen log, and around it the ground was disturbed, as though someone had been sitting or crouching there for a long time. The footprints clustered in the dirt, circling the spot again and again. He stared at them until the hairs on his arms bristled. There were more than one set now. Several sizes, some small, some larger, all bare, all pressed deep into the earth, as though whoever made them had been waiting there, watching, or perhaps gathering. A sharp snap of a branch pulled his head up, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Something pale slipped behind a tree, quick and deliberate. His chest tightened, every instinct screaming at him to run, and that was exactly what he did. He turned and bolted back toward the cabin, the woods blurring around him, branches clawing at his clothes, roots threatening to trip his steps. He didn't dare look behind him, certain that if he did, he would see someone chasing him. When he finally stumbled through the door and slammed it shut, his chest was heaving and sweat dripped down his forehead. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping the poker with white knuckles, and tried to steady his breathing. But as he forced himself to peer out the window, he saw nothing but the motionless trees. Nothing moved. Yet his heart told him that whatever had been in that clearing was closer now, maybe even standing among the trees just beyond the cabin. Waiting for night to fall again, night fell with an oppressive weight, thicker than the nights before, as if the forest itself had decided to close in tighter around the cabin. Daniel sat with every light in the house burning, the fire roaring in the hearth, but still the shadows seemed to creep across the floorboards and gather in the corners. His body was worn thin from sleeplessness, yet the idea of closing his eyes even for a moment filled him with dread. He kept glancing toward the windows, convinced that if he looked away too long, a face would be waiting on the other side of the glass. The hours dragged, each minute stretching endlessly. At first, the forest was silent, but then came the noises, soft steps crunching on the frozen earth, deliberate movements circling just beyond the cabin walls. Daniel held the poker in his grip and moved quietly to the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. He expected the same empty darkness, but this time he caught a glimpse of something. Between the trees, faint and almost ghostly, stood a figure. It was pale, thin, unmoving, its shape blurred by the night, yet its presence undeniable. His stomach turned cold, his breath caught, and when he blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed by the forest. He backed away from the glass, pressing himself into the center of the cabin, as far from the windows as possible. The footsteps outside grew bolder, closer, circling steadily until he could track them moving from one wall to the next. Sometimes they stopped completely, only to resume minutes later from a different side. It was as though whoever was out there was studying the cabin, studying him, trying to find the best way inside. At one point, he heard the soft tap of fingers against the wood, a slow and rhythmic sound that traveled along the wall like someone dragging their hand across it. His mind raced with possibilities. Should he make a run for it, try to escape into the woods, or was that exactly what they wanted him to do? He couldn't imagine being trapped outside in the darkness, with the figures moving just beyond the trees. The cabin, fragile as it was, at least offered walls between him and whatever hunted him. Still, he knew it was only a matter of time before the walls wouldn't be enough. Then, as if to confirm his fear, a sound came from the door, a soft rattle, the unmistakable twist of the handle. Daniel froze, staring at it, every muscle in his body locked. The handle moved again, firmer this time, a subtle test of the lock. He stepped forward, clutching the poker tighter. His breath ragged. The door shuddered once as though something pressed against it, then stopped. Silence returned, heavier than ever. But Daniel's heart told him the silence meant only one thing. Whoever had been outside was no longer content with circling the cabin. They were ready to come in. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in as Daniel sat rigid in the silence that followed the rattling of the door. His nerves screamed at him to move, to do something, yet he could only stand there with his eyes fixed on the handle, waiting for it to twist again. Minutes dragged into an eternity before he finally backed away, forcing himself to breathe. The fire had burned low, shadows stretching long and skeletal across the floor, and with every flicker of flame the cabin seemed to warp and shift around him. He told himself to stay calm, to think clearly, but the thought of being hunted outside by unseen figures gnawed at his mind until the idea of leaving seemed as terrifying as staying. The night pressed on, and exhaustion weighed heavy on him. At some point, his body betrayed him, his eyes slipping shut despite his will. He drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, the crackling of the fire blending with the imagined sound of whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. In one dream, he saw pale faces staring through the windows, their eyes dark voids, their mouths open in silent screams. When he jolted awake, his heart hammered as though he had truly been watched. He rubbed his face, trying to shake the fog of sleep, but then froze. The fire was nearly out, though he had stoked it only hours ago. The room was colder, darker, and from somewhere outside came the faintest sound of movement. Daniel crept toward the window, every muscle trembling. The forest beyond was drenched in shadow, the moonlight weak against the towering trees, but he could make out shapes shifting in the darkness, not animals, human-like, tall and thin, moving with strange, deliberate grace. There were more than one this time, two, maybe three, standing at a distance, their pale forms just visible between the trunks. They didn't move closer, but he knew they were watching. He staggered back from the glass, heart thundering, and pressed himself against the wall as though he could melt into it. The sound of scraping returned, slow and methodical along the outer wall. He followed it with his ears, each drag of fingers creeping from one side of the cabin to the next. It stopped beneath the window near his bed, and though he could not see it, he felt the weight of eyes on him, studying waiting. The poker felt useless in his hands, a fragile weapon against whatever stalked him. His mind raced, desperate for an answer, but reason offered none. The hours stretched on an unbearable blur, every second punctuated by the fear of the door rattling again, or the glass shattering. But the figures outside remained patient, circling, whispering through the silence in ways he could almost hear but not quite. By the time the faint light of dawn bled into the sky, Daniel sat slumped against the wall, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his grip on the poker still firm. He knew the daylight offered no real safety anymore, only a brief pause in the game the figures were playing with him. The pale glow of morning filtered through the windows, but instead of bringing comfort, it revealed the true state of Daniel's unraveling. His face was gaunt, skin clammy, eyes bloodshot and hollow from endless nights without rest. Every creak of the cabin's floorboards set his nerves on edge, and every brush of wind against the trees sounded like footsteps closing in. The cabin had once felt like a retreat, a place of quiet solitude, but now it was little more than a prison, one that only delayed the inevitable moment when the figures outside would finally step inside. Determined to find answers or perhaps a way out, Daniel forced himself to venture back into the woods. The sun hung low, its light filtering weakly through the branches, but even in daylight, the forest felt suffocating, too still, too quiet. He retraced the path he had followed before, back to the clearing where he had seen the disturbed ground. His heart pounded as he stepped into it again, scanning every tree, every shadow, bracing for a glimpse of movement. What he found instead made his skin crawl. The footprints were fresher. The soil was darker in spots, damp as though pressed only hours before, and there were more of them, overlapping, intersecting, a chaotic tangle that suggested restless pacing. Kneeling, he studied the prints more closely, and his stomach churned when he noticed the details. The impressions weren't right. The toes seemed too long, stretched unnaturally, and the arches of the feet were shallow, almost flat. Some of the prints were impossibly small, as if made by a child, while others were broad and heavy, pressed deep into the earth. They were not the marks of people simply wandering. They were deliberate, purposeful, forming a rough circle around the clearing like a ritual. A rustle snapped his head up, and he caught the briefest glimpse of movement at the tree line, something pale slipping out of sight. The air seemed to thicken, heavy and oppressive, and his instincts screamed at him to leave. He turned and hurried back toward the cabin, every step a battle against the growing sense that he was not merely being watched but followed. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and more than once he thought he heard the crunch of leaves behind him, matching his pace before falling silent. When the cabin came into view, relief surged through him, but it was short-lived. The ground around the cabin was worse than before. Footprints circled it in tight, erratic loops, and the soil beneath the windows looked churned, trampled by countless passes through the night. The sight made his chest tighten as he stumbled inside and locked the door behind him. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood, fighting to steady his breathing, and the grim truth settled over him. The figures weren't wandering aimlessly. They had been waiting, watching, and each night they were drawing closer, as though closing a net around him that daylight could no longer hold back. The hours that followed dragged on in an agonizing haze, the thin light of day doing little to ease Daniel's dread. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind was trapped in a constant state of vigilance. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The distant crack of a branch, the whisper of wind threading through the trees, the groan of the cabin's aging timbers. He knew now that the figures weren't a fleeting hallucination or a trick of his sleep-deprived mind. Their footprints told a story clearer than words. They were real. They were many, and they were growing bolder. Daniel tried to steady himself with small, practical tasks. He piled wood into the fireplace, filled a pot with water, even attempted to eat, though the food tasted like dust in his mouth. He told himself he was preparing, though deep down he knew he was staving off panic. His hands shook constantly, and he caught himself glancing at the windows every few seconds, as if expecting faces to appear against the glass. When the sun began its slow descent, staining the trees in muted gold, an unbearable weight pressed down on him. Night was coming again, and with it they would return. As twilight bled into the forest, the atmosphere shifted. The silence of the woods became suffocating, not natural stillness, but the quiet of anticipation. He lit every lamp in the cabin, every candle he could find, until the interior glowed in fragile defiance of the dark outside. The poker never left his grip, the iron cold and slick in his clammy hand. For a while nothing happened, and the waiting became almost worse than the encounters themselves. His thoughts spiraled in the quiet, whispering fears that gnawed at him. What did they want? Why hadn't they broken in already? And how much longer could he endure before his mind collapsed under the strain? Then the sounds began again. At first, faint and scattered, soft steps brushing against leaves, twigs snapping under deliberate weight, but soon they multiplied, a chorus of movement weaving around the cabin. Daniel froze where he sat, his breath shallow, as the sounds closed in. The circling was faster this time, less cautious, like predators growing confident. He thought he could hear low voices carried on the night air, indistinct but rhythmic, as though the forest itself murmured in tongues he could not understand. The first knock rattled the window nearest to him, a sharp, jarring sound that made him jump to his feet. Another came from the far side, then another, a chain of taps and thuds moving from wall to wall. His heart pounded violently as the cabin shook under the assault of unseen hands. Shadows passed outside the windows, elongated and distorted by the flickering lamplight within. He dared not look too closely, but in the corner of his vision, he caught flashes of pale limbs and faces pressing briefly against the glass before vanishing. The knocking ceased all at once, replaced by an awful silence that was worse than the noise. Daniel stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, the poker raised, knowing with a sinking certainty that this night would not be like the others. They weren't testing him anymore. They were ready to force their way inside. The cabin seemed to breathe with him, every creak of the wood echoing his own shallow gasps as he waited in the terrible silence that followed the knocking. His nerves were so taut that the smallest sound made him flinch, but then came a new one, unlike the cautious taps of before. It was heavier, deliberate, a slow dragging along the outside wall, as if something massive scraped its way around the structure. Daniel's throat tightened as he followed the sound with his eyes, imagining its path even though he could not see. The fire flickered weakly, throwing shadows that danced across the walls, and he clutched the poker tighter, praying it would be enough to defend himself if the door gave way. A sudden bang shook the front door in its frame, the wood groaning under the force. Daniel stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs, certain the lock would snap. Another bang followed, then another, each one more violent, rattling the cabin to its bones. He braced for the crash that would signal his last moment of safety, but just as suddenly as it began, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was so deep it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He forced himself to step closer, his knees weak, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. Something told him not to, every instinct screaming to stay back, yet he needed to know if the door was still holding. His palm hovered over the cold metal, when a faint scratching came from the other side, soft at first but rising in tempo, like fingernails clawing through the wood. He yanked his hand away and staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The scratching continued for long minutes before ceasing, leaving him standing in the oppressive silence once more. His thoughts turned desperate. He couldn't endure another night trapped in here, waiting for whatever circled the cabin to finally break through. He glanced at the window, considering escape, but the image of pale figures moving through the trees paralyzed him. He could almost see them there, waiting, their faces blank and eyes fixed on the cabin, patient as death itself. Running would only deliver him into their arms. The air inside grew colder as hours dragged on. His breath misted in front of him, despite the embers glowing faintly in the hearth. He swore he could hear faint whispers seeping through the walls, voices too low to decipher but heavy with intent, threading into his ears like poison. Covering them with his hands did nothing. The whispers grew louder, closer, as though they were now inside the room with him. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, bending and twisting in shapes that did not belong to the firelight. Daniel's body trembled violently, his mind fraying under the weight of terror. The poker slipped from his grasp, clattering against the floor, but he barely noticed. All he could do was stare at the door, waiting, because deep down he knew the night would not pass as it had before. This time, the barrier between him and the figures outside was breaking, and nothing could keep them out forever. Daniel sat in the dim cabin, every nerve stretched to breaking as the night deepened around him. The fire had burned to smoldering coals, the light barely pushing back the shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe in the corners of the room. The silence was absolute now, not even the creak of trees outside, as though the forest itself waited. He forced his eyes to the door, convinced it would burst inward at any moment. Then, without warning, a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the wood. 3 times, heavy and hollow, each strike vibrating through his chest. He froze, unable to move, his breath caught in his throat, the sound resonating like a signal that everything he had feared was finally at hand. The doorknob rattled, then turned, though he had locked it firmly. The cabin groaned as if buckling under unseen weight, and the air grew frigid, his breath clouding in the thin light. Shadows stretched across the walls, lengthening, twisting until they resembled figures, pale and thin, their heads tilting unnaturally as though studying him. He stumbled backward, his legs weak, pressing against the far wall with nowhere left to retreat. His mind screamed at him to run, to smash a window, to flee into the forest, but his body would not obey. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, though the lock should have held. Darkness seeped inside first, denser than the night outside, and within it forms began to emerge. They were just as he had glimpsed before, gaunt, impossibly tall, with faces too pale, their eyes empty pits that reflected nothing. Their movements were smooth and unnatural, gliding rather than walking, yet their weight pressed on the cabin like a suffocating presence. Daniel tried to raise the poker, but his hand shook so violently it slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as the figures advanced. Whispers filled the air, layered and overlapping, not in a language he could understand but heavy with intent, a chorus that drilled into his skull. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound only grew, reverberating inside his head until his vision blurred with tears. One of the figures reached out, its long, skeletal fingers stretching toward him, and for a moment the entire world seemed to contract to that single gesture. Daniel's scream tore through the night, but no one was there to hear. The forest swallowed it whole, leaving the cabin silent once more. When dawn came, the cabin stood still among the trees, its door slightly ajar, its interior undisturbed but empty. The footprints circling it led off into the woods, vanishing where the shadows grew thick, as if whatever had come for him had carried him away. Daniel was never seen again, and those who later stumbled upon the cabin would speak of an oppressive silence that lingered, a sense of being watched, and the faint echo of whispers that rose with the wind. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to support the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share it with others who love chilling true horror tales. Your time and support mean everything, and I'll see you again with another story soon. Until then, stay safe and never ignore the silence of the woods.